Okay, so we can begin. What we'll be doing tonight is something very, very different than what we've been doing for the past year. We're going to be taking a little bit of a break from the series on Tehillim, on Psalms. B'ezrat Hashem, we'll come back to it another time. I decided to begin a new series very soon. This series will be called something like the challenges of the 21st century. The many challenges that humanity faces, Jewish and non-Jewish. These challenges apply to all. These are situations or circumstances that we're facing that our forefathers did not have to deal with. We are going to be confronting them, so we have to know how to deal with them, how to confront them properly. Very difficult situations. And that's why I'm calling them challenges. Challenges does not mean they're insurmountable. It means that we can deal with them. We just need to know how. So B'ezrat Hashem, perhaps the next couple of weeks will begin. In the meantime, I decided to give a little bit of an introduction to some of the issues that we'll be talking about. And tonight is about the Mabul, the flood, the Genesis flood. We just read about it in the Torah in Parashat Noach, that there was a big flood. And this flood is no ordinary flood. This flood covered the entire face of the earth. Something that does not happen. Something that should never happen, and it will not happen the way it is described. Hashem promises, God promises that it happened once and that's it. A flood of those proportions, of course, killed everything that was around. And except for one family, Noach and his children, everything became extinct that was alive on earth. Except also for the animals that he took with him, two, at the very least, two from every species. Now the word species is a very important word to have in mind, because when we say species, we don't mean necessarily every kind of animal. There are many kinds of dogs today. Many, many kinds of dogs. And many of these dogs today did not exist years ago. Only in the past few hundred years, some of these dogs, I don't want to say were created, but came about through interbreeding, intentional interbreeding by humans. So when we say species, we're talking about a very limited number of animals that represent a certain species, that eventually later on multiplied and became different kinds of animals that belong to the same family, to the same genera. There's various names to categorize or to classify the animal kingdom. But suffices to say that when Hashem created the dog, he did not create many, many dogs. He created perhaps several kinds of dogs, but not many, many dogs. And the same is with cat, and the same is with the camel, even though you have a llama and you have an alpaca in South America that appear to be similar, right? They could have belonged to one particular animal in the past, or possibly not. Possibly in the very beginning you had two or three, but not many. That's just the point that I want to bring out in the very beginning. Because this will help us deal with the many animals supposedly that were in the Teva, and that will of course pose a question. How could he do it? Is it really possible? All the animals in the Teva, in the ark? So it's not as many as we think they are. In other words, today we see many species and many that are related to the species, but it doesn't mean that they all existed at one time. And therefore, when we're saying he took two, or at the very least two, of certain kinds and seven of the other kinds, we're talking about a limited amount of animals that existed then, which is not that much after creation. The flood, according to the Torah, takes place in the year 1656 from creation. So before we begin to talk about the flood, the details of the flood, and how the world has changed ever since, I want to mention the following. In the Haggadah of Pesach, we talk about 4 children. Haggadah says that the Torah had in mind 4 children, 4 types of people, I guess you could also say. Chacham, Rasha, Tam, Vesheno Yoda Lisho. You recall, right? The Chacham is the wise individual. The Rasha is the wicked individual. The Tam is the simpleton. Simpleton, in other words, he's not very righteous, he's not very wise, he's simple, plain. And then you had the She'eno Yoda Lish'ol, the one that does not know even how to ask a question. He doesn't bother getting involved, he doesn't have questions, he doesn't involve himself in any discussion. He stays by the sidelines. And as a result of that, of course, this individual, She'eno Yoda Lish'ol, does not ask questions, does not even know how to ask a question, he loses out a lot in life. Because life is short. And many of us, I'm sure, have many questions. And if we're not going to ask them, and we're going to live our lives in doubt, then our lives, of course, will be greatly impacted, not necessarily positively. People make mistakes. People later have regrets, only because they didn't ask, they didn't consult and seek advice in the right time. One of the difficulties that the one has who does not believe, the Rasha, is that he begins with the assumption that there's no creator. He's already beginning with that assumption. Instead of trying to find out, to discover, to figure it out, he begins with a certain assumption. This is too miraculous, this can't be. Now, when one begins with this approach, or when one has this kind of an attitude that I've already made up my mind, don't confuse me with the facts, he's going to have many difficulties in life. Creation is complex. Life is complex. The purpose of life, the meaning of life. So he will have not only difficulty in believing, in being convinced, because he started off with certain assumptions, but he will have difficulties in life. A lot of things will not make too much sense to him. Now the Chacham does not really need this lecture so much. The Chacham knows, he's knowledgeable, he's studied, he's wise enough to hear a logical argument, to accept it, perhaps to argue with it. He does not begin with any assumption. If anything, he begins with the assumption that he's ignorant and that he does not know it all. That's a true Chacham. Why is a Talmid Chacham called a Talmid Chacham? The term used in the Talmud by the rabbis, that he is the student, a scholarly student. Why student? Because we're always students. We're always learning. We never think for a moment that we know it all. It's impossible for the human being to know it all. As Solomon says, even if you were to live for 1,000 years, you would not know it all. There's so much to know. The human mind is limited. And even if we're wise and intelligent and studious, and we covered a lot of ground, we're still limited in our observation, in our ability to analyze, and so forth. So we need to be a little bit humble, especially when dealing with complex topics. The Tam, the one who's ignorant, who's simple, he has a lot to gain by acquiring the knowledge. By attending a class, it will make a big difference. He's not against it. She'eno yodea lishol, as we said before, is really at a loss because he doesn't even know to ask. So we really need to approach him and tell him, come on, don't you have any questions? You should have questions, you should ask. And what a difference it will make if you do ask and you get the right answers. But even so, this lecture is also intended for the Chachamim, for those who are wise, for those who do know about the flood and about other topics of interest, simply because what this will do is to reinforce what they know, to reinforce their faith, their emunah. Emunah, which we call faith, is not just blind belief. I believe you. I'm not so sure, but I believe. No. Emunah, faith in Judaism, implies I know for a fact. Oh, you really do? You're so convinced? You're so confident of this? If you ask the average Jew who is a believer, could he tell you with confidence that he knows for a fact that this is true? Not everyone. his emunah is not strong enough. It needs further encouragement, stimulus, study to reinforce his belief, his faith. True emunah therefore implies yedi'ah. I know it for a fact. To know something, you really have to gain clarity to it. So what we want to do here is also reinforce what we already know, to strengthen our emunah, and more importantly, to prove that the girsah, the version of the Torah, of the Bible, is true. We're not going to here, with this topic, going to prove that God created the world. That's another lecture, that's another topic. I don't want to prove from the flood that God created the world, even though it's possible, perhaps indirectly, to show that's true. What we really want to accomplish is not only to present facts, and not only to become more familiar with what happened during the flood, but to realize that the account of the Torah is a real account. What is being narrated to us in the Torah is real. So that's what we want to do here. And that, of course, is important for all the 4 types of children. Regardless of how much we know, it's good to know that what the Torah writes is 100% true, and we can prove that. The advantage, however, that we have, those of us who have faith in God, who believe in the Torah already, who have that upbringing, that education, is that we will have less difficulty understanding miraculous or difficult to understand events in our history. There have been some miraculous events that go against the laws of nature. And it's difficult to explain them scientifically. Yes, scientifically it could be difficult to explain. How do you split the Red Sea? Right? So there are many things that are miraculous. Well, if you believe, if we have faith in a God who created the world, this beautiful world that is just full of so much wisdom, so much intelligent design, so much beauty and harmony, so perfect. If there is a creator out there who did all of this, then what's the big deal? He can do anything else he wants. If he can create a world, he can't create a miracle, another miracle. He ran out of miracles. I mean, he created the world. That's the greatest miracle of all. Created the human being, created all the species in the world. So if that's where we start with, if that is our faith, then we will have less of a difficult time understanding many details that appear to be very difficult to comprehend scientifically. Well, we don't owe anything to science. We don't have to prove anything to science. We have to be confident ourselves. The problem is that we live in a generation where science has, if I may use this metaphor or this example, they are the greater power today, similar to what the church was in the past. Remember, in the past, in history books that you've read, how powerful the church was, especially in Europe. Today, the church maybe has many members, but science is the one that dictates what you will read in your biology books. Even though they're not supposed to give their opinion about how the world began, that's not supposed to be something that they're supposed to discuss. That's not something scientific. How the world began. I don't believe science has the tools to prove how the world began. You want to be philosophical about it in a class on philosophy, then you can discuss creation. Religion, you can discuss creation. But science is wielding a lot of power today. They want to influence the beliefs of people in areas of religion too. It's none of their business how the world began. It's not possible to prove in the laboratory. I mean, it's just too difficult. They finally at least agree that there was some beginning. They call it the Big Bang. Then they go on with evolution. If you remove God, then you have to come up with something crazy. They say creation is crazy. Well, I think everybody would agree that evolution, not the Big Bang, but the evolution, especially macroevolution, that man came from monkey and so forth, all these things in a random way, without any design, without anyone directing it this way, is not only crazy, it's impossible. Whereas creation could be possible. Why not? Why? I mean, after all, look around and use your head and analyze. Your watch didn't come about by itself. So much design, it's so perfect. Then why should the world and creation be any less? Why should it be any less? Why can't we use this argument? They don't want to. They try to, of course, counter any argument that you bring to them with all kinds of refutations that are not real. You can see that there is an agenda out there not to allow any possibility. They say it's not possible that there's a creator. Well, once you eliminate a possibility, a possible scenario, you're not a truth-seeking individual. And I would not even call him a scientist. Scientist who really is interested in figuring things out should be open-minded about any possibility, even though it's miraculous, yes. Especially if you use your head and you use the neshama, the soul that is endowed in every human being to figure it out, you should be able to, because Hashem wants us to be able to figure it out. He didn't make it so difficult. He concealed himself for good reason. And that's another topic, why he concealed himself. Okay, he's concealed. But go find him. You know, like hide and seek. There's a game called hide and seek. Oh, God is playing hide and seek. Go ahead, find me. Look for me. This is what I want you to do. I don't want to make it too obvious. Then what's the purpose of all of this? So there's a reason for that. So, if we begin to understand that there's a creator who's behind many, many things that happen in this world, then we can have an easier time understanding why certain things happen. It doesn't mean that we will understand everything, but at least certain things we will be able to figure them out. And as you will see, that many cultures share what the Torah writes. Many cultures, many civilizations have written very similar accounts. In other words, that the understanding is more or less what happened. And that's what I want to bring out right now at the very start. That this account of the Mabul is not only documented in the Torah, it's not something that only the Jews talk about. It's written even in the Quran. The Quran speaks about it too, briefly, mentions Noah. In the old civilizations, it's brought down in the Babylonian civilization, famous epic of Gilgamesh. It's brought down in the Sumerian civilization, individual by the name of Ziusudra, or Trahasis, depending on which civilization we're dealing with. Many Indian cultures in North America, South America, have something about this major flood that occurred once upon a time. So you have an account about this flood all over the place. So, if everybody's talking about it, doesn't that say something? No, they're all making it up. Especially when you look closely to what they say, you will see that they say very similar things, many similar details. So before we get to those similar details, what exactly happened in the Mabul? Just a brief description of what the Mabul was. Hashem is upset at the generation, at the people who are living then. They have corrupted their ways. They are occupied only with vice and totally disconnected from any service of God. They are involved in thievery and stealing from each other. They're corrupt and degenerate society, full of depravity, I guess, if we want to be a little fancy here. So Hashem decides to destroy the world. Did he know this was going to happen? Why did he create it? I mean, that's a good question. When you learn Parashat Noach, you can get the answer for that. Why did God create the world when he knew, and he does know in advance, that this was going to happen? I don't want to keep you in suspense, so I'll just tell you briefly that even though God knows certain things in advance, sometimes he allows certain things to happen to bring out a point, to teach a lesson. And here, one of the lessons is, whenever in the future you have major natural disasters, you should know, it's the same me. Behind it, like I was the one that brought the flood, it's me. Behind the tornado, behind the hurricane, behind the earthquake. No major flood again over the world, but on a smaller scale, you will have all kinds of natural disasters. And what are they for? Well, they have something in common with the flood. Something is wrong. And I'm letting you know. So we have here a major flood that covers the entire world. Rains for 40 days. The water does not recede for 150 days. A whole year goes by until finally, a little more than a year goes by until finally the water has receded and the land is dry. Noach builds a teva. He builds an ark which will spare his family and spare all the animals, representatives of all the animals, the birds and so forth. Not the fish. The fish stayed in the water. Nothing happened to them for the most part. Same thing with the whales, all aquatic species. Not all, but many survived. So here we have Noach in the teva that he's instructed to build, the details of which we have in the Torah, how big, how tall, how wide, how to seal it, waterproof it from the inside and from the outside. From the inside too, and from the outside, yeah. According to the Midrash, we have a tradition that there was hot water too. Part of the water was boiling water. Because when we have rain, it's not just rain from above. We have waters coming from underneath the ground. What kind of water comes from underneath the ground? Cold water? Yes and no. Did you know that there's boiling water coming from underneath the ground? A lot of places in the world. I can show you a beach in Mexico where you just dig about 6 inches into the sand and your hand becomes very, very hot. Hot water comes out. Sulfuric. And this is all over the world. There's places like that. So here you have a mixture of hot and cold and lots of water coming down from above and from underneath. So the whole world is covered with water and everything dies. And throughout the year, the water is covering even the mountains, above all the tall mountains. I'm not so sure that Everest was around then or that it was that high. But Mount Everest, which today is the tallest, the highest mountain above sea level, is over 29,000 feet high. So that means that the teva had to be several feet or meters above that mountain, so it should not, crash into it. So you could imagine how much water covered the surface of the earth. Well, with that amount of water and pressure, because there's pressure, you know what that did to the ground? Noach came out of the teva and he saw that the world was not the same world that he knew. According to the Midrash that sheds more light into the story as to what he observed, as to what exactly happened to the world, all of a sudden ridges, valleys, gullies, canyons, Grand Canyon, yeah. Something like that doesn't just happen overnight. It would either take a certain amount of years or a tremendous amount of pressure, especially water, to create something like that. And there's proof that the waters reached there. They find all kinds of aquatic fossils in these high places. Well, how did aquatic fossils get there? Unless the water got there. So there's enough evidence that the waters did reach high places. Some scientists don't want to subscribe to the flood that the Torah writes, but they say, well, there must have been some flood, but it was not all over the world, not exactly like the Torah describes. Okay. But at least they realized that there was some sort of flood. So briefly, that's the story of the flood. A major cataclysmic event that occurred once on this scale. Now, I'm careful to say on this scale because I will soon introduce you to two additional floods that were very close to being a major floods as well. But this is the one that covered the entire earth. Okay, so now that we know more or less what happened, approximately, let's see what all the other civilizations write about the flood. And I'm not going to quote every single one. I'm just going to mention the details, the few details where they agree almost to the word with the Torah. You have like this. One detail that's brought down is that there was a global flood that was caused by the gods. Okay, so they say gods, but they said global flood. And they say that this flood was so big that it reached and covered the highest mountains. They write that this flood killed everything alive on the ground, all that was alive. They write that only one individual remained behind, him and his family. And they write that from this one individual and family, all of humanity today comes out from. They write that too. That this family was saved by building an ark, a teva. That to this ark, two of each were brought, of each animal, of each species. That after the flood, those who survived, in other words, that family, they brought sacrifices to the gods. So, does it match? Pretty much. These are the basic details that appear in the Torah, and they appear in many of these civilizations out there who have been around for a long time. Some of the difficulties that people have believing this, I'll just go through a few, is that, okay, I can believe there was a big flood. Noah somehow knew there was going to be a big flood. He built a teva. That you can do today too. There are tsunamis. I guess these kinds of things can happen. But there are still some difficulties. They still have questions that are difficult to answer, unless you believe in God. How did Noah accomplish what he accomplished as far as storing all these animals, feeding them, taking care of them? Was that really possible? Did Noah really get every animal in there, every species? Even if it's two of each, but still, that's a big job. I agree, yes. No doubt about it. This is a phenomenal, very difficult, complex assignment. But the Torah pretty much adds a little bit more details of how this happened. They came to him. He didn't have to go looking for them. They came. How did they come? Did they have a GPS? Remember, we're talking about who's in charge here? God. Hashem is in charge. He's the one that's letting him know that there's going to be a flood. What to do and how to go about it. He's not going to help. Of course he's going to help. What does he expect Noah to be able to carry this out? Which two should he choose? Anyway, so once you agree that there is a creator, and that this creator, by the way, did not only create the world, he's involved, as Judaism believes. He's involved with what is going on in the world. You know, there are some believe, yes, God created the world. It didn't happen by itself. But he's no longer involved. He removed himself. He bailed out. Not be told. No. There's enough evidence to show that God is involved in all of history, throughout history, mankind. You see his fingerprints. So how does he accomplish it? It's possible to accomplish, as we began to explain before. He took in the main species that existed then, not necessarily what we see today. But what about those big dinosaurs? They existed, didn't they? I mean, you can see them in the museum. They were real. They existed once upon a time. Who said he had to take the big ones? What does he want to do? He's to preserve the species, right? How do you preserve the species? You take the babies, you take the small ones, you take the young ones. You don't have to take the big ones. You know, how is he going to fit him? Wait, think a little bit. He didn't have to take the big ones. So he didn't take every single animal that we see today. He took those that represent the species. And eventually, later on, of course, those species multiplied, interbred. You know what a mule is, right? You know God did not create the mule. Man did. And still does. And the mule is not the only one. There's other animals, right? Some families are larger. In the owl family, you have all kinds of owls. You'll be surprised how many kinds of owls there are. It doesn't mean they all were there in the very beginning. The only problem is that certain interbreeding is not good, because the offspring of the interbreeding, if it's not exactly the same family, even though they're related, horse and donkey, right? There's some relation, but they're not exactly the same. The offspring is not fertile. Even though there have been some incidents where the mule did have an offspring, but these are exceptions. For the most part, I'm talking about generally. It's a known thing, it's a known fact, that the offspring of certain mixtures will not be fertile. All right, fine. So somehow Noah accomplished it. The next difficulty that they have, well, how do they all get to where they got? You know, they came down, the Teva, according to our tradition, the Torah, came down on the mountains of Ararat, which is on the border between Turkey and Armenia, not too far from Iran. Okay, how do the animals get to North America? How do they get everywhere? Well, begin to think a little bit, and maybe if one begins to think, he'll be able to figure it out on his own. First of all, animals migrate. You know about migration, right? Big distances, all the time, even today. So animals can travel very far, especially when looking for food. So animals migrate, that's number one. Number two, man did take with him certain animals wherever he went. So that, of course, at least partially explains how animals got everywhere. The problem, however, that people have, or some scientists have, is that, wait a minute, I don't understand something here. Why are there certain species in North America that do not exist in Asia? How come we find a certain turtle, a big turtle, in certain islands in the Indian Ocean and on certain islands in the Pacific Ocean, right off the coast of South America, the big tortoise, and we don't see it anywhere in between? Not North America, not South, just over here, and that's it? How come just there and there? Take the cougar, as we know it here in California, mountain lion. The mountain lion is very, very spread out. It's a very interesting animal. There are not too many animals like it that you will find from Alaska till the tip of South America. He's almost everywhere. Maybe you won't find too many in certain states. After all, the east part of this country today does not really have too many, except for in Florida, the panther. But they used to exist. So this animal, for some reason, exists in North and South America. A beautiful animal, a wild animal, but beautiful. And does not exist in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, I mean, you have other kinds of lions there. Why? Why should there be here and not there? In South America and in Central America, you have an animal called the jaguar. Not the car, the animal. Okay? Fascinating animal. Incredible abilities. No jaguars in Africa. No tigers in Africa either. Did you know that? Tigers? Only in Asia. India, Nepal, Bhutan, China, Burma, Thailand.
And why is that?
Tigers. I'll get to that. Tigers. What do we have in Africa? Oh, we have leopards. But leopards we also have in Asia. Leopards we have in China. Cheetahs you have in Iran. A little bit. Right? What happened to all these animals? How come here yes and here not? Well, first of all, just remember a very important point. When it comes to the animal kingdom, many animals have become extinct over time. The only ones that receive the blessing to multiply and to be many in the millions that will never become extinct, for the most part, are the fish. You know why the fish cannot become extinct, right? Because the Japanese need a lot of sushi. So God made sure that there will always be an abundance of fish. But anyway, the fish received a blessing that there will always be many fish. And the rabbis tell us, really, because they're so much hunted that they needed a blessing. We hunt them by the millions. So they have a blessing. All other animals don't have that blessing. Animals have become extinct through all kinds of ways. By human intervention, overhunting. Look what's happening today. Do you know how many rhinoceros are left in the wild? Even tigers. Not too many. There used to be 100,000 tigers in India at the turn of the 20th century, I think, just in India alone, or in that area. And today there's only about 3,500, last count, approximately, of a certain type of tiger. There's all kinds of tigers. There's a tiger in Indonesia, a tiger in China, a tiger in Siberia, in that area. But there's not that many left. Why? Human encroachment, hunting them for the fur, and disease. It could be disease too. So over time, animals that were not procreating so much became extinct.
No, fish are a very healthy source of protein and low saturated fat.
Yes,
and it's
sure.
recommended as one of these sources.
Perhaps we'll make a lecture about that too, about all the, the benefits of consuming fish, but that's another idea. All right, so you have animals that you can only see today in museums that existed. Here, not too far from us, is a place called La Brea Tar Pits. I recommend that you go and see what happened over there. It's fascinating. Now, their explanation I don't accept. They say that there was a lot of tar. The word brea in Spanish means tar. La Brea, the tar. There's a lot of tar. If you just dig in the grass not too far from that place, you'll see it bubbling from the ground. And they say animals got stuck there. First of all, the mammoth or the mastodon or the elephant got stuck there. Then came the wolves to eat it and they got stuck there. Then after the wolves got stuck, the vultures came and they got stuck. You know, that is how they explain how so many animals got stuck in one place. What's interesting about that is not just the tar and how they got stuck there. It's interesting also because of the many, many animals that are no longer around. They're extinct. One of them is the saber-toothed tiger. You can see it. Skeletons, complete skeletons, many of them, not just one or two. Maybe if you dig in your backyard, you'll find something. You never know. Anyway, how did they all get there? I don't think anybody knows for sure 100%, but it is possible that as a result of the major flood. According to our tradition, there are certain locations on Earth where the majority or lots of the skeletons and the carcasses, the dead animals, fell to. Lower areas, valleys, certain areas where many of them came down, many of them floated to. And somehow there was tar there too. I mean, obviously it's sticky. So it could be that it has something to do with the flood. But what I wanted to bring out over here is, yes, there are many species that are no longer around. And somehow, some species remained in North and South America, and some remained elsewhere. Do you know, up until the first or second crusade, there were lions in Israel. Lions. Lions. No more. I mean, it'd be dangerous to travel, around if there were still lions there. Do you know that up until 1955, there was a couple lions in Iran? Maybe you don't know. Yeah, in the Shiraz area, in the south. In Iraq, they had quite a few not too long ago. And today, the Asian lion is only seen in certain parts of India. The Asian lion, not the African lion. What happened? Well, killed. There used to be a very nice tiger. I say nice because everything Hashem made is nice. The Caspian tiger. Caspian tiger was seen everywhere in Russia, in many places in Russia, Turkey, Uzbekistan, that whole area there. And because the Russians wanted to make the Trans-Siberia Railroad, the orders were given to shoot these tigers, that they shouldn't interfere with the construction and other projects they were making. And they got rid of that tiger. What a shame. So unfortunately, some human beings do not have respect for all these beautiful species that Hashem made that are there for a reason. So that explains partially why certain animals do not exist anymore in certain areas of the world. The one piece of the puzzle that is missing, however, that really does a lot more than just explain about species, is that there was something called the Continental Drift. Continental Drift means as follows. Once upon a time, when God created the world, He did not create Hawaii. He did not create a jigsaw puzzle of many pieces. He created one yabasha, one continent, pretty much. So how do we end up with 7 continents, if you include Antarctica? Right? How's that? Well, remember the big flood that we're talking about? There were 2 additional floods. One, before the big flood, there was one major flood that covered 1/3 of the globe during the generation of Enosh, and one flood that covered 2/3 of the globe in the generation of the Palaga, when they built the Tower of Babel. 2 additional major inundations, shitfonot. One covered 1/3, the other one covered 2/3. I don't recall which one it was. Do you know what it is to cover 2/3 or to cover 1/3 and to have a major flood? So you have 3 major global floods that caused tremendous damage to the surface and brought about all kinds of other changes as well. And they in themselves could have gotten rid of many of the animals. Why get rid of the poor animals? Well, why destroy the world? It's just the people who were misbehaving. So I explained it in one of the Rashot that I gave, that when man corrupts his ways, the world itself, and including the animal kingdom, has become contaminated too because of the impurity that he brought about to the world. Everything is contaminated. And water has the segula, has the quality of purifying and cleansing. So if you ask why did he bring water and destroy so much, he could have just sent a plague, Ebola. Right? Everybody's afraid of it today. Send Ebola and just, these people are not doing their job. Criminals, right? Why destroy the world, destroy all the animals? The animals were created for mankind. The world was created for man. Man is the crown of creation. If he misbehaves, if he goes against the will of God, then everything is destroyed with him. That's the lesson that he should learn. So you have all these continental drifts. You know what pressures or what tremendous impact this had? Not only on the surface of the world, on everything. Species were moved around. Continents were severed. Now, this didn't happen at once. It happened over time. And that is why they say that at one time there was a bridge, a land bridge between Asia and North America. Otherwise, how did the Indians get here? Where it is apparent that the cradle of civilization is the Middle East. Asia. Well, they traveled. So how did they cross? By boat? Canoe? Well, that's also a possibility. But it makes sense. Not only does it make sense, we know that once upon a time they were connected. Asia was connected to North America. So that's how animals crossed over. And that is how human beings crossed over. But eventually things drifted even more and more. And certain animals did not go over to the other country. It's interesting. Look at another animal that you may never have heard of. Fascinating animal called the wolverine. I don't think most of you have heard of it. Have you heard of the wolverine? Unless if you're from Michigan, maybe you did, because that's the animal of the state of Michigan, I think. A very, very interesting animal. It looks like a small little bear or a very, very big badger, however you want to describe it. Very, very tough, with a big appetite. And you see this animal in Asia, you see this animal in Scandinavia, only in the certain cold climates, not everywhere. But you see him here in North America too, in the cold climates. So here you have, interesting, an animal that is there and here. The wolf actually is another animal. You have it here and there. You have certain animals. I mean, coyotes we don't have there in Asia. You have here for some reason. But who says there was a coyote in the very beginning? Right? Doesn't that coyote remind you of a mixture of a wolf and a fox, perhaps? Or of a dog? Right? So certain animals, remember, came about later on. They did not necessarily exist in the beginning. So somehow certain animals remained in both continents, in several places, and some did not, partially because of this continental drift. Continents drifted. Partially because certain places they suffered, became extinct, either through human intervention or through other ways. And one of the biggest questions that science is tackling, and even those who believe in the flood and believe in the Torah also have a little bit of a hard time understanding, is the Ice Age. And I'm not going to get too much into it, just a little bit. Ice Age, they claim, did away with a lot of animals as a result of the supposedly long period of frost and cold, that animals froze to death. And they have proof of this, of course. You can see it somewhat in the geological strata, that there was different kinds of climates. And at one time, things died out because of cold, perhaps, because of flooding. And even though it did not cover, I don't believe it covered the whole world, there's no proof of that. It did cover certain latitudes. They found frozen mammoths. The question about this Ice Age, there's several questions about it. First of all, when did it happen? The Torah doesn't say there was an Ice Age. And we know that there is a lot of ice left over from the Ice Age, because look at Greenland, look at Antarctica. And Greenland and Antarctica don't just have a little bit of ice or snow. Layers upon layers. We're talking about thousands of feet. And you think that this was always like that? No. They have been able to detect the bottom layers that were once tropical. And this is great, because we know that once upon a time before the Mabul, the whole world was a subtropical climate. There was no extremes of cold. So what happened here? Now, it's important to remember that you don't have to have the answers to all the questions. Yes, there may be some questions out there that we may not have the answers or the complete answer that will satisfy every scientist as to why these things happen, how they happen, and so forth. It's okay if we don't know everything. After all, we don't know everything. But the question is nonetheless, how could so much ice accumulate in such a short time? If you believe that the world is 5,775 years, like we believe, How could there be so much ice? Where did it all come from? Remember, they say the world is millions of years old, so you have an ice age, then the ice melted, and you have another ice age. For the most part, we believe that there was possibly one ice, major let's call it glaciation. A lot of ice, could be. It could be was on more than one occasion. We have blizzards all the time. But to properly understand it, I will just say the following. And I think this should really hit it on the nail. They complain about so much ice, and so much ice really naturally cannot accumulate even in 100 years. Naturally. I admit, I agree, that if you were to propose that this happened over 100 years, it's difficult to explain. But let's keep in mind the following ideas. Idea number one. The Mabul changed the atmosphere all over the world. The Mabul brought about, the Midrash says, a push to the tilt of the earth, of planet Earth. It's tilted now. It was not tilted in the beginning. Tilted. Now we have 4 seasons. And now you have extremes as well. You did not have extreme weather in the very beginning of creation. Things were much calmer. Things were temperate, with a continuous mist. The weather was completely different. That's when you cannot judge the past from the present. The only thing that you can use from the present to compare it to the past is if you look at an explosion on Mount St. Helens, the volcano in 1980, the incredible force that let out and the destruction it caused can really be a valuable lesson on what such major cataclysmic events can do to the entire world. Look what that mountain did. Just one mountain. Look at what it did to the whole area. And you can get an idea. We see major flooding today, what it does. And here we have flood all over the world. 150 days of water, hot water, continental drift. So much going on. Plus the weather changing. The atmosphere changing. That it could be that somehow we have this tremendous drastic amount of snow and ice building up. But wait a minute, yes, okay, fine, granted, a lot of the ice was formed as a result of all of these cataclysmic events. But how do you get so much? Because we know that after a while, a lot of it melted. And you still have a lot of it now. Where did it all come from? So this is a question that not everybody has a clear answer to. Scientists, remember, have their own way of looking at the world. Using millions of years, you can explain anything almost. But how do we look at it? Besides the major events that we know that they in themselves, together with the tilt, the change in the tilt, together with the change in the atmosphere, caused definitely a change in the weather. Besides this, just remember one detail, and that should suffice. If so much water can be brought on the world in 40 days to cover the entire globe, above the mountains, water comes from underneath and from the top. If so much water can come in just such a short period of time, why can't God bring about so much ice in a short period of time also? Simple, very simple. It's definitely difficult to explain scientifically and naturally, but it obviously happened in ways that we don't even know. My question, however, is now how it could happen. I'm not interested in that. What did I say before? Lo chashuv. That's not so important. It happened. Just like the flood happened, it happened. Why would God allow so much ice to accumulate? That's what interests me. Who needs that ice? Nobody even thought of this question. Nobody even discusses it. I haven't seen anybody raise this question. Why have so much ice? What's the purpose of all this ice? Unless you're going to tell me you're going to use it for water, drinking water. Here comes the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah tells us that there's a tradition, a Kabbalistic tradition, that right before Mashiach comes, a lot of that ice will melt and the oceans will rise once again. The sea level will rise and will flood many coastal towns. If the sea is going to rise, how's it going to rise? I'm adding the words that ice will melt. Maybe, again, this is maybe because we don't know for sure anything. Maybe one of the reasons why all this ice was accumulated is for some major future event, which is what is brought down in the Kabbalah. Because you know what happens if a lot of that ice melts. That's exactly what will happen. This is scientific already. They know that that will happen. All you need is for the ocean to rise a couple feet, and that will flood major coastal cities a lot, several miles inland. And if you don't believe that can happen, look what happened in Japan. There's videos and pictures of it, of how far inland it went. That was just a tsunami from a small earthquake. So, that could be one reason of why there is so much ice. How it got there is not that important. If all that water from the flood got there, all that snow can also, or all that ice can also get there in all kinds of ways, especially when we know that there was so much going on between the continental drifts, the hot water, the change in the atmosphere, the change in the tilt of the earth. So many drastic changes that this could have happened in a short time. As far as going back to the Teva of Noach, as far as Noach in his Teva, it has been proven, given the dimensions, that it would be possible to store all those animals. In other words, that's not such a big deal, even though that sounds also fantastic. They did the math on that. And if in fact it was only the species that existed or lived then, and not all the ones we see today, that may be more feasible. The 3 floods that I told you about, is even though it's in our tradition, I did find that the Greeks have an account of that too. I think they're the only ones that also discuss 3. I saw the flood of Ogyges, the flood of Declion, Dardanus. It's interesting that they also have an account of 3 major catastrophic floods.
The Chinese also talk about a flood, and they have
that's right. That's right.
Showing the flood.
That's right.
I've heard that.
And as a result of all these floods, you have so many fossils in deep layers. I mean, layer after layer after layer is added with time, right? So to have all these fossils somehow wiped out all at once, why all at once? Oh, some asteroid they want to claim somehow killed them all off. The flood explains a lot better how many died suddenly, because you find them all together. You find them all approximately in the same layer, the strata. Some of them fossilized, some of them not. When something fossilizes, that is very unusual. It means it happens so quickly. Otherwise, if something just dies, it rots, it's eaten by scavengers. Even the bones after a while fall apart. So for something to be preserved for a while, even the footprints were preserved in many cases, or the skin was preserved. That means that something happened suddenly, and it was covered up immediately by so much sediment. That's a flood. So there's a lot of evidence in the fossil record that there was some major event that happened that all of a sudden killed off so many animals. What about the Teva of Noach? The Teva of Noach, where is it today? You know, there have been some accounts of people that looked for it and they claim they found it. It's possible. They went more or less to the general location of where it's supposed to be, and they found traces of it. Or they found the shape of the mountain. Possible. I'm not so sure because I didn't go out there. I didn't do my own tests. But in the past, during the time of the temple, the Second Temple era, there were historians who spoke about that, how in that area people still go fetch some of the wood of the teva to use it as an amulet of protection. In other words, they believed in that. So eventually the wood, of course, being exposed to the elements, also fell apart, or they were taken by people, but before you know it, it was all gone. So what happens after the flood? We're left with I was going to say arcoiris in Spanish. We're left with a rainbow. So what's a rainbow? It's beautiful, isn't it? What does Hashem say, what's the rainbow for? No more floods on this kind of a scale. And this will be my sign to you. Whenever you see it in the cloud, there could have been a major flood, but I made a promise. But wait a minute, I thought a rainbow was something natural. It's a natural phenomenon. What you're seeing is through a prism, you're seeing all the colors. And it's really nice. There's even a blessing to say on seeing something like that. So even though it's natural, what the Bible is really telling us is that, yes, it's natural, but it doesn't happen all the time. When it does happen, that will be my sign. I want to give you a sign. That will be the one. Whenever I choose to make one, it will, of course, happen in a natural way after a rain, but that will be the sign. If you see a major rainbow, sometimes there's a double rainbow, and that will be a sign that there could have been a flood, whether in that location or elsewhere, I don't know. But because of the promise, there is no major flood. There are still local floods, but no major flood. What is there? There will still be disasters, unfortunately, major disasters from time to time, in various places on Earth. And they are, of course, indicative of what happened in the past. In the same way that in the past there were major disasters as a result of the wrong behavior, immoral behavior of humanity, the same is true today. Is that these disasters are nonetheless intended to remind us that Hashem is still in charge, even though He made a promise that there will be no more floods. So just to finish up, there are all kinds of pieces of evidence out there that can prove many things, many historical facts that make us feel good. Those of us who believe, it makes us feel good. It reinforces what we already know. But you don't need that. It's not that important. It's good if it's there. It definitely can help those who have doubts, but we don't need it. And the reason I say we don't need it is because you have to be careful. If you depend too much on all these evidences, and there's some question about it that is raised by the non-believers, it may somehow undermine what you always knew out of pure, sincere faith. There's nothing more powerful in the world than pure, sincere faith, which says, I know for a fact my grandparents did not lie to me, neither did my forefathers. They were witnesses. They know what they were writing. This is real. And even though I may not understand every little detail, even though I may not find evidence to everything that the Torah says, I don't need it to be a strong believer. Those who were only relying on evidence and trying to be philosophical about creation, they are the ones who are weaker. And whenever there is a storm, like a Holocaust or an Inquisition, when they're forced to choose sides, or whether letting go of their faith and embracing another religion, they will fall. The chances are they may not be able to withstand the challenges, the pressures. Those who withstood the challenges the best were those who had pure faith. Nonetheless, it helps. It's very nice that we have evidence, that we have some proof, that we're able to see that there are other civilizations out there that agree with us, that say the exact same thing. And of course, it helps us because we want to make sure that we don't just believe blindly, we do know it for a fact. So again, we don't need it, but it's very nice that we could see that there's a lot of evidence there nonetheless, and even other civilizations have documented about this. The point of all of this is that a Jew needs to be equipped as best as possible to confront any challenges that come his way. Somebody says, how could this be true? This couldn't be true, that the world is only 6,000 years old. Come on. What do you, it's like they say in Yiddish, a baba meise, God forbid. It's fairy tales. No, it's not fairy tales. If you start out believing that there is a God in this world, then things make more sense. Don't try to come from the end to the beginning. Start from the beginning. Start out right. Assume that this beautiful world was created. Then everything else is easy to explain. If you start out from the end, well, yeah, how do we have so much ice here? It must have taken millions of years. Otherwise, how do you explain it? Of course, it's going to be more difficult to climb to the mountain of God, and to accept His commandments. Why should he do that? He doesn't see it, because he started off with all this amount of snow, this ice age, and all this confusion. Start out by analyzing creation, how beautiful it is. This is what Abraham did. As a young man, he says, wait a minute, what are we doing here? What's this all for? Who made all this? But people don't ask these questions. They're too busy watching TV, looking at the internet, reading a novel as an escape, doing all kinds of things that have nothing to do with reality, enjoying themselves, going on vacations. People are not thinking. Today they think less than they did in the past. People are so busy today, they're so tense, they're so materialistic, that it becomes even more of a challenge for them to make any sense of this. They're not interested even in this. Oh, they want to see a movie about some action. Superman, Spider-Man, all these kinds of things. Yeah. I'm not talking about children, I'm talking about adults. Adults are seeing these movies. That's what fascinates them. Ignorance. Ignorance. So much ignorance in this world today. And when somebody's ignorant, stay away. He's dangerous. I don't necessarily mean physically. I mean, God forbid, we don't want to be cooled off by these people, who appear to be intelligent. They have maybe even a PhD. Yeah. So that is why, Baruch Hashem, that we have the Torah. We have to just make sure that we study what it says. So B'ezrat Hashem, our emunah should always remain strong.
Amen.